Hey guys, tonight we travel back more than 5,000 years, to a time when the world was still figuring out how to count. You trudge barefoot through the soft, sun-baked earth of ancient Mesopotamia, where the air smells faintly of damp clay and freshly cut reeds. There's no electricity, no internet, not even wheels yet, just you, your thoughts, and the slow, deliberate rhythm of daily survival. You wake before dawn like everyone else, because sleeping in is only an option if you enjoy missing breakfast and getting yelled at by your neighbor for laziness. The sky is just beginning to lighten over flat, dusty plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This place, this land of mud-brick homes and bustling temple courtyards, is about to give birth to something quietly revolutionary: record-keeping. You probably won't survive this experience. Not in the sense of actual danger, but because it's going to be incredibly boring. No battles, no betrayals, no scandalous love affairs. Just people sitting around scratching symbols into wet clay with sticks. But stick with me, because this is a foundation of everything from your grocery list to your tax returns. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're watching this from somewhere far away, drop a comment with your city and local time. I always find it oddly soothing to imagine people all over the world drifting off to the same sleepy history lesson. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year, if you could call it that, is sometime around 3400 BCE. You're standing in Uruk, one of the first great cities in human history. It's not much to look at by modern standards. No skyscrapers, no traffic jams, definitely no coffee shops. But it's buzzing with activity. People trade goods, build houses, worship gods, and try to keep their goats from wandering off. And somewhere in the middle of it all, someone has a simple but profound idea. What if we kept track of stuff? Not just, I have 2 sheep, or you owe me 3 jars of honey. That kind of thing had been done for ages, usually with physical tokens. Little clay shapes representing animals, grain, or oil. But now, someone decides to scratch a symbol into a soft slab of clay instead. Maybe they were tired of carrying around hundreds of tiny tokens. Maybe they were just bored and wanted to doodle. Either way, this small act marks the very beginning of writing, and the birth of the world's first accountants. These early record keepers weren't called accountants, of course. They didn't even have a word for numbers the way we do. But they had a job, keeping track of what belonged to whom, who owed what, and how much food was stored in the temple granaries. Without them, civilization as we know it would never have gotten off the ground. Historians still argue whether this shift, from tokens to symbols, was intentional or just a happy accident. Some believe it started as a game, a way for traders to pass time while waiting for their goods to arrive. Others think it was a religious innovation, a way to better serve the gods by tracking offerings and tithes. Either way, once those first marks were made, there was no turning back. And so, under the hot Mesopotamian sun, you watch as the world takes its first clumsy steps toward bureaucracy. You might not feel particularly excited about it, but trust me, this is the quiet engine that will drive everything that comes next. You're still in Uruk, watching as that first scratch symbol becomes more than just a mark. It becomes an idea. Someone somewhere decides this little shape doesn't just stand for 1 sheep or 2 jars of oil. It stands for the concept of 1 and 2. That might not sound like much to you now, but back then, it was revolutionary. You see people experimenting with different shapes. Some look like tiny triangles, others like zigzags or straight lines. They press these into wet clay with a reed stylus, making impressions that dry under the sun until they harden into something permanent. These aren't just doodles anymore. This is record keeping. This is accounting before anyone even had a word for it. At first, these symbols are simple, just representations of real-world objects. A circle means a jar of oil. A squiggle means grain. A triangle might mean a sheep. But soon, someone realizes they need more precision. How many jars of oil? How many sheep? And so, numbers start appearing alongside those symbols. Not written out like we do today, but as tally marks, short lines grouped together in neat clusters. This is how math begins, not with equations or theories, but with practical needs. People want to know how much they have, how much they owe, and how much they'll have left after giving some to the temple. You can almost picture it. A trader standing at the edge of a market, scratching his head as he tries to remember if he gave 3 jars last month or 4. He mutters to himself, grabs a lump of clay, and makes a few quick marks. There, now he won't forget. And that's the thing about Mesopotamia. Everything here starts small and practical. No one wakes up one day and says, "Hey, let's invent writing." It just kind of happens, bit by bit, as people try to keep track of their stuff. Over time, these symbols grow more complex. Some represent sounds instead of things. Others combine to form new meanings. Eventually, this system becomes so advanced that it evolves into full-on language. But believe it or not, writing didn't start with poetry or philosophy or even love letters. It started with lists. Lists of grain, lists of livestock, lists of taxes owed. The world's first words were probably something like 10 sheep delivered or 5 bushels stored. Historians still argue whether writing truly began for administrative purposes or there was a religious or artistic component from the very beginning. Some think early scribes might have been recording myths or prayers long before they ever kept track of goats. But most agree that bureaucracy came first. So here you are, standing in ancient Mesopotamia, watching as humanity takes its first slow steps toward literacy. You might be thinking, this is all very fascinating, but also incredibly dull. And you wouldn't be wrong. But that's the point. This isn't history filled with drama or action. This is the quiet, steady march of progress. The kind that puts food on the table, keeps temples running, and ensures that no one accidentally give away too many sheep. The sun beats down, the air is thick with dust, and you feel your eyelids getting heavier. Because while this might not be exciting, it's undeniably soothing. The rhythm of daily life, the gentle tapping of styluses against clay, the soft murmur of traders haggling over goods, it all blends together into a lullaby of human ingenuity. You step into cool shade of a temple courtyard, where the air is thick with the scent of incense and damp clay. This isn't just a place of worship. It's the beating heart of Mesopotamian life. And right now, it's also the world's first office building. Inside, people are moving in quiet, practiced patterns. Priests oversee offerings. Workers haul sacks of grain. And somewhere near the back, a small group hunches over wooden tables covered in soft slabs of clay. These are the record keepers, the earliest known accountants. They don't have fancy titles or uniforms, but they're among the most important people in the city. After all, if no one keeps track of how much barley comes in and goes out, the whole system collapses. The temple granaries rise like ancient skyscrapers around you, filled with neatly stacked baskets of grain, jars of oil, and crates of dried fish. It's not glamorous work, but it's essential. The gods need to be fed, the priests need to be paid, and the workers who maintain the city's canals and walls expect something for their labor. Someone has to make sure everything is accounted for. That someone is the scribe. You watch as one of them presses his stylus into a fresh tablet, making careful marks that will tell future generations exactly how many sheep were donated this week, how much bread was baked for workers, and which families received extra rations during the flood season. There's no room for mistakes. Every symbol represents real goods, real people, real survival. Historians still argue whether these early scribes were considered full-fledged members of the temple staff, or more like independent contractors hired when things got busy. But one thing is clear. Without them, the temple couldn't function. The economy of Mesopotamia ran on trust, and trust required records. You lean closer, watching as another scribe rolls a lump of clay between his hands before flattening it into a neat rectangle. He carefully etches a series of symbols down the middle. Some represent numbers, others stand for commodities. A few look almost like pictures. A circle for oil, a zigzag for wool, a triangle for sheep. It's slow, meticulous work, but there's something oddly satisfying about it. And that's the thing about Mesopotamia. Everything moves at its own pace. No rush, no urgency, just steady, deliberate effort. You can almost imagine yourself sitting here, stylus in hand, pressing tiny marks into wet clay while the world hums softly around you. But it's not just about keeping track of stuff. These tablets serve another purpose. You see one being handed off to a trader heading out on a long journey. It's proof of what he's carrying, what he's supposed to deliver, and what he should expect in return. Without written records like these, trade would be chaos. People would forget promises, dispute deliveries, and generally make a mess of things. It's strange to think that so much responsibility rests on the shoulders of a few quiet men scratching symbols into clay. But that's how civilization grows. Not through grand speeches or epic battles, but through careful planning, honest accounting, and a lot of patience. You yawn, feeling the warmth of the afternoon sun settle over you like a heavy blanket. The rhythmic tapping of styluses against clay blends with the distant chatter of traders and the occasional bleat of a wandering goat. It's not exciting, but it's peaceful. And sometimes, peace is exactly what you need to fall asleep. You stay in the temple courtyard, watching as more tablets pile up on wooden shelves. The scribes work steadily, their styluses tapping against clay like a soft drumbeat. But something catches your eye, a tablet that doesn't just list numbers and goods. This one has symbols you don't immediately recognize. They're more detailed, more deliberate. One scribe traces his fingers over the marks, muttering to himself as he checks the tally of barley sacks delivered from a nearby village. Another flips through a stack of tablets, comparing records from last season's harvest with this year's offerings. And then there's a third, older, with ink-stained fingers and a furrowed brow, who's doing something different. He's not just recording numbers anymore. He's writing a sentence. It's subtle, but it's happening all around you. These early record keepers are realizing that symbols can do more than just track sheep and grain. They can tell stories. They can explain transactions. They can even give instructions. A simple mark for barley becomes 5 bushels of barley given to temple worker. Then, slowly, it becomes 5 bushels of barley given to temple worker on the 3rd day after the new moon. This is how writing evolves, from practical shorthand to full-blown language. At first, these symbols only represent concrete things, objects, quantities, maybe even names. But soon, people start using them for abstract ideas too. Ownership, time, purpose. You watch as one scribe adds a small flourish to his tablet, a tiny symbol that means because, or for what reason. It's a small change, but it opens a whole new world of communication. No longer just lists. These tablets now contain meaning, context, history. Historians still argue whether this shift was intentional or if it grew naturally out of necessity. After all, once you start keeping track of who gave what to whom and when, you need more than just numbers. You need explanations. You need reasons. You need clarity. And so, writing begins its slow transformation from a counting tool to storytelling device. Religious hymns get recorded alongside trade records. Temple rules are etched into clay beside tax receipts. Even myths start appearing in the margins, small, personal notes from scribes who probably got bored between entries. You glance at one tablet, resting near the edge of the table. It shows a series of animals walking in pairs. 2 lions, 2 goats, 2 birds. It looks almost like a drawing, but it's not random. Someone used symbols to tell a story, perhaps about a great flood or a journey across the desert. Whatever it meant back then. It's a reminder that writing was never just about counting. It was always about understanding. The sun shifts slightly, casting long shadows across the courtyard. The air is thick with the scent of warm clay and old parchment. Somewhere nearby, a goat bleats softly, and you feel your eyelids drooping again. Because while this might not be an action-packed tale of conquest or romance, it is deeply soothing. There's something comforting about watching human progress unfold at its own pace. No rush, no drama, just quiet innovation, steady hands, and the gentle rhythm of styluses pressing into wet clay. You follow one of the younger scribes as he makes his way through a narrow alley, away from the bustling temple courtyards and into a quieter part of the city. The sun is high now, casting sharp shadows over the mud brick walls. The air is thick with dust and the distant hum of daily life. Traders shouting, goats bleating, children splashing in canals. But this boy doesn't seem to notice any of it. He's focused on where he's going, because today is another day at school. Yes, school. You might not think of ancient Mesopotamia as having formal education, but here it is, a place where young boys and occasionally girls, if their families are particularly forward-thinking, gather to learn the most important skill in the city, writing. The building you approach isn't much to look at. No grand arches or fancy decorations. Just a simple courtyard with a few small rooms off to the sides. Inside, rows of clay tablets sit stacked neatly on wooden shelves. A handful of students already hunch over fresh slabs of clay, pressing symbols into them with careful precision. At the front of the room stands a teacher, an older man with ink-stained fingers and a face that suggests he has little patience for nonsense. You watch as the boy takes a seat and unrolls his stylus pouch. His fingers are still clumsy, his marks uneven. This is only his second week here, and he's still learning the basics. For now, all he does is copy symbols again and again, trying to get the shapes just right. It's tedious work, pressing triangles, circles, zigzags into wet clay until they start to feel natural under his hand. This is how every scribe starts. There's no skipping ahead, no shortcuts. If you want to be trusted with recording grain shipments, temple donations, or even royal decrees, you need to prove you can handle the basics first. And the basics? They're about repetition, muscle memory, discipline. You glance around the room. Some students have been here for years. Their hands move with practiced ease, their tablets filled with neat columns of numbers and symbols. Others fidget impatiently, clearly wishing they were outside playing instead of copying the same set of signs for the 10th time that morning. Historians still argue whether these schools were strictly reserved for the elite or if talented commoners could rise to the ranks with enough dedication. Either way, one thing is certain. Becoming a scribe was one of the best jobs you could hope for in ancient Mesopotamia. Unlike farmers or laborers, scribes didn't have to break their backs in the fields or haul heavy bricks under the scorching sun. Instead, they got to sit indoors, surrounded by soft clay and quiet concentration. Still, it wasn't an easy path. Learning to write took years, sometimes up to 10, and failure was common. Many dropped out early, realizing that they simply couldn't keep up with the demands of memorizing hundreds of complex symbols and mastering the fine art of record keeping. Those who made it, though, they became some of the most respected members of society. Back in the classroom, the teacher claps his hands sharply, silencing the scratching of styluses. He walks between the desks, inspecting each student's work. When he reaches the boy you followed, he pauses, tilts his head slightly, then nods once. Not a smile, never a smile, but a silent acknowledgement that, at least for today, this boy is doing okay. Outside, a breeze stirs the dry reeds growing near the canal. The sun begins a slow descent, casting long shadows across the courtyard. The world keeps turning, and somewhere in this quiet little room, the future of civilization is being carefully pressed into wet clay. You leave the quiet hum of the scribal school behind and follow one of the older scribes through the winding streets of Uruk. The city is alive with movement. Traders haggle over baskets of figs, potters shape clay on spinning wheels, and children chase each other between market stalls. But your guide doesn't pause to watch any of it. He has a job to do. And today, that job takes him straight to the palace gates. Inside, the air is cooler, shaded by thick stone walls and high ceilings. You step into a grand hall where officials bustle about, carrying tablets and scrolls, whispering in hushed tones. At the far end, seated beneath an intricately carved wooden canopy, is the king himself, or at least someone who speaks for him. This isn't a place for idle wandering. It's where power lives, where decisions are made, and where, more importantly, records need to be kept. The scribe you followed steps forward, unrolling a small bundle of tablets from his pouch. These aren't just any records. They're detailed accounts of everything the kingdom owns. Grain stores, livestock counts, temple offerings, tribute payments from conquered cities. Every single item. Carefully pressed into clay so there can be no disputes, no misunderstandings, and certainly no missing sheep. You watch as he kneels before the royal accountant, presenting his findings. A few assistants hover nearby, ready to copy the information onto duplicate tablets for safekeeping. This is how wealth was measured in ancient Mesopotamia. Not just by gold or jewels, but by how much grain a ruler could store, how many oxen they owned, how many jars of oil their people had set aside for winter. And if that sounds dull, well, that's the point. Because while warriors and kings get all the glory, it's these quiet record keepers who actually make sure the system runs smoothly. Without them, No one would know exactly how rich or how poor a kingdom really was. Historians still argue whether these royal scribes were trusted advisors or simply glorified bookkeepers. Some believe they held real influence, whispering in the ears of rulers about which cities were thriving and which needed more support. Others think they were just another cog in the machine, expected to remain silent and unseen unless called upon. Either way, one thing is certain. If you want to know what a king truly owned, you ask a scribe. You glance around the room. The walls are lined with shelves filled with tablets stacked neatly in rows. Some are labeled with simple marks indicating their contents: grain, dates, copper ingots. Others have longer inscriptions detailing shipments arriving from distant lands, lists of workers assigned to canal projects, even records of diplomatic gifts exchanged between rival cities. It's easy to forget, standing here, that this is history's first bureaucracy. There are no filing cabinets, no computers, no spreadsheets. But there is order. Everything is accounted for, everything is documented, and nothing is left to chance. Outside, the sun continues its slow descent, casting long shadows across the palace courtyard. Somewhere beyond those walls, traders are wrapping up their day, farmers are returning home, and families are preparing evening meals. But inside, the work never stops. The kingdom must be managed, and management requires records. The scribe finishes his report, rolls up his stylus, and bows slightly before turning to leave. You follow him back out into the warm Mesopotamian air, where the scent of baked bread and drying reeds fills your lungs. The world keeps turning, and somewhere in this vast city, another tablet is being pressed into wet clay, another piece of history quietly recorded for the future. You follow the scribe to the winding streets of Uruk, past bustling markets and shaded courtyards, until you reach the towering gates of the temple. Unlike the palace, where power is wielded with authority and ceremony, this place hums with a quieter kind of influence. Here, the gods are not just worshipped, they're managed. Inside the temple grounds, the air smells faintly of incense and warm clay. Priests in flowing robes move between rooms, overseeing offerings, preparing rituals, and tending to the daily needs of the divine. But just beyond the main hall, tucked behind heavy curtains and carved wooden doors, another world exists, one of ledgers, inventories, and careful planning. This is the heart of Mesopotamian economics. The temple isn't just a place of worship. It's also the city's largest employer, its biggest landowner, and its most powerful business. It owns fields, flocks, and fisheries. It employs bakers, brewers, weavers, and builders. And at the center of it all are the scribes, quiet, methodical record keepers who ensure that every grain of barley, every jar of oil, and every woolen robe finds its way to the right hands. You watch as one scribe unrolls a bundle of tablets from his pouch, handing them off to a senior official seated on a low wooden bench. These aren't religious texts or prayers to the gods. They're accounts, lists of deliveries, records of transactions, and detailed inventories of what's been given, taken, and distributed. A few assistants hover nearby, ready to copy the information onto fresh clay slabs for safekeeping. This is how wealth was measured in ancient Mesopotamia, not just by gold or jewels, but by how much grain a temple could store, how many oxen they owned, how many loaves of bread they baked each day. And if that sounds dull, well, that's the point. Because while priests chant hymns and light sacred fires, it's these quiet record keepers who actually make sure the system runs smoothly. Without them, no one would know exactly how much oil had been used in the last offering, how many workers had been paid their monthly rations, or whether there was enough wool left to keep the weavers busy through the winter. Historians still argue whether these temple scribes were considered full-fledged members of the clergy or more like independent contractors hired when things got busy. But one thing is clear. Without them, the temple couldn't function. The economy of Mesopotamia ran on trust, and trust required records. You glance around the room. The walls are lined with shelves filled with tablets stacked neatly in rows. Some are labeled with simple marks indicating their contents: oil, dates, copper ingots. Others have longer inscriptions detailing shipments arriving from distant lands, lists of workers assigned to canal projects, even records of diplomatic gifts exchanged between rival cities. It's easy to forget, standing here, that this is history's first bureaucracy. There are no filing cabinets, no computers, no spreadsheets. But there is order. Everything is accounted for, everything is documented, and nothing is left to chance. Outside, the sun continues its slow descent, casting long shadows across the temple courtyard. Somewhere beyond those walls, traders are wrapping up their day, farmers are returning home, and families are preparing evening meals. But inside, the work never stops. The gods must be fed, the people must be paid, and someone has to make sure it all happens on time. The scribe finishes his report, rolls up his stylus, and bows slightly before turning to leave. You follow him back out into the warm Mesopotamian air, where the scent of baked bread and drying reeds fills your lungs. The world keeps turning, and somewhere in this vast city, another tablet is being pressed into wet clay, another piece of history quietly recorded for the future. You step into the cool shade of a stone-carved courtroom, where the air is thick with the scent of old parchment and warm clay. This isn't just any building. It's one of the oldest legal centers in human history, and today, it's buzzing with quiet activity. Traders haggle over debts, farmers dispute land boundaries, and scribes sit at long wooden tables, carefully copying records onto fresh tablets. At the center of it all sits a judge, dressed in flowing robes, his expression unreadable as he listens to yet another case unfold. But before any verdict can be reached, someone must ensure that the facts are clear. That job belongs to the scribe. You watch as a man steps forward, holding out a tablet covered in neat rows of symbols. It's not poetry or myth. It's a record of a contract signed months ago, detailing exactly how much grain was promised in exchange for a field. The opposing party argues that they never received what was agreed upon. The scribe calmly flips through a stack of matching records, proving otherwise. Without these written accounts, disputes like this would drag on indefinitely, decided by guesswork or favor rather than fact. This is the role writing played in ancient Mesopotamia, not just for trade or temple management, but for justice itself. Laws needed to be recorded so everyone knew what was expected of them. Contracts had to be preserved so no one could conveniently forget their promises. And punishments? Well, those were documented too, ensuring consistency across generations. One of the most famous examples of this legal record-keeping is the Code of Hammurabi, a collection of 282 laws carved into stone more than 3,700 years ago. It covers everything from property disputes to personal injury, from business contracts to family obligations. But before it was ever chiseled into a towering stele for public display, it was first copied, again and again, by scribes who ensured its survival long after Hammurabi himself was gone. You glance at one young scribe bent over his desk, carefully etching each law into soft clay. His stylus moves with practiced precision, pressing tiny marks that will tell future generations exactly what was considered fair and what was not. Some laws seem harsh by modern standards. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Others feel surprisingly practical, even reasonable. If a builder constructs a house that collapses and kills the owner, the builder shall be put to death. If a farmer floods his neighbor's field through negligence, he must repay the lost harvest. Historians still argue whether these laws were applied consistently, or if they mostly serve as guidelines rather than strict rules. Some believe they were meant to impress upon people the idea of order and consequence, rather than function as rigid statutes. Either way, one thing is certain. Without scribes to copy and preserve them, we might never have known them at all. Outside, the sun continues its slow descent, casting golden light through narrow windows. The city hums softly beyond these walls, traders calling out their wares, children laughing near the canal, goats bleating somewhere in the distance. Life goes on, steady and unbothered. Inside, the judge raises his hand, signaling the end of the case. The scribe rolls up his stylus, bows slightly, and moves on to the next record needing attention. You follow him back into the warm Mesopotamian air, where the world keeps turning, and somewhere in this vast city, another tablet is being pressed into wet clay, another piece of history quietly recorded for the future. You find yourself on the edge of a bustling trade route, where the air is thick with dust and the scent of dried dates, wool, and sweat. The road ahead stretches far into the horizon, winding through dry plains and rocky hills, leading to distant cities you've only heard whispers about. Babylon, Mari, Ebla. This isn't just a path. It's a lifeline, a thread that binds Mesopotamia to the wider world. And right now, it's teeming with movement. A caravan of donkeys steps carefully over uneven stones, their backs loaded with sacks of grain, bundles of reeds, and jars of oil sealed tightly with wax. Traders walk alongside them, chatting in low voices, checking straps, and adjusting loads. Some are heading east toward the mountains, others west toward the sea. Wherever they're going, one thing is certain. This journey won't be easy. Trade in ancient Mesopotamia wasn't just about exchanging goods. It was about trust. When you send a load of barley across hundreds of miles, how do you know it will arrive intact? How do you ensure the person on the other end actually receives what you promised? And if something goes wrong, if a sandstorm delays a shipment or bandits make off with part of the cargo, how do you prove who owes what to whom? That's where the scribes come in. You watch as one of them kneels beside a wooden crate, unrolling a bundle of tablets from his pouch. He checks each item against a list, pressing careful marks into soft clay to record exactly what is being sent. Quantity, type, destination. All must be documented before the caravan departs. Without these records, disputes will be endless, debts unpaid, and trust shattered. A merchant approaches, wiping sweat from his brow. He nods at the scribe, then gestures toward a second tablet resting nearby. This one is different. It bears a seal pressed into wet clay, marking it as an official contract. It's proof that both parties agreed to the terms. So much grain delivered by a certain date, in exchange for copper ingots or fine textiles. If either side fails to uphold their end, the tablet serves as evidence. Historians still argue whether these early contracts were legally binding in the way we understand law today, or if they function more like social agreements upheld by reputation and community pressure. Either way, one thing is clear. Without written records, long-distance trade would have been nearly impossible. You glance around the caravan site. Nearby, a group of men load barrels of wine onto a cart, while another pair inspect the hooves of their donkeys, making sure none are lame before the journey begins. A few children run between wagons, laughing, their bare feet kicking up clouds of dust. Life here moves at its own pace. Steady, deliberate, never rushed. Back at the scribe's table, he finishes his final mark, rolls up his stylus, and hands a completed tablet to the merchant. The man tucks it safely into a leather pouch strapped to his waist, nodding once in thanks. Then, with a sharp whistle and a flick of the reins, the caravan begins to move. The sun climbs higher, casting long shadows behind the departing travelers. Somewhere down the road, new cities await, filled with unfamiliar faces, strange customs, and exotic goods. But for now, all that matters is the steady rhythm of footsteps, the creak of wooden wheels, and the quiet certainty that someone, somewhere, has written it all down. You stand at the edge of a battlefield, or at least what's left of one. The dust is settled. The cries of warriors have faded into silence, and all that remains are the quiet, methodical movements of those who follow in the wake of war, logisticians, medics, and yes, scribes. This isn't the kind of history you usually hear about, the heroic charges, the noble duels, the speeches before battle. No, this is the slower, quieter side of conflict. The part where someone has to count how many men showed up, how many made it back, and what exactly they brought home from the fight. A group of soldiers trudges past, their armor dented, their faces tired but alive. Behind them come carts loaded with supplies, some filled with food and water for the return journey, others carrying spoils of war. There's gold, of course, but also more practical things, weapons, shields, even livestock taken from the defeated city. Someone needs to keep track of all of it, and that someone is already at work. You watch as a scribe kneels beside a wooden table set up under a makeshift awning. He unrolls a bundle of tablets from his pouch and begins scratching symbols into wet clay with careful precision. His stylus taps against the surface in a steady rhythm, recording names, numbers, and descriptions. How many men marched out? How many returned? What was taken from the enemy camp? And most importantly, who gets credit for capturing it? War in ancient Mesopotamia wasn't just about glory. It was about logistics. Armies needed food, weapons, and shelter. Commanders had to know how many soldiers they were leading, how much grain they had stored, and whether they could afford to stay on campaign for another month or two. Without accurate records, chaos would reign. You glance around the campsite. Nearby, Cooks stir large pots of stew over open fires, while blacksmiths hammer away at bent swords and broken spear tips. A few men sit in small groups, sharing stories and laughter, try and forget the weight of the day. Life here moves at its own pace, steady, deliberate, never rushed. Back at the scribe's table, he finishes one tablet and reaches for another. This one will list the rations distributed to the troops tonight. How many loaves of bread? How many jars of beer? How many dried figs? It might not sound exciting, but it's essential. Soldiers can't fight on empty stomachs, and generals can't plan campaigns without knowing what resources they have available. Historians still argue whether these military scribes were considered full-fledged members of the army or more like civilian contractors hired when things got busy. Some believe they traveled with the troops, keeping records in real time as battles unfolded. Others think they stayed behind in the capital, compiling reports based on messages sent by messengers on horseback. Either way, one thing is certain. Without them, no commander could hope to run an efficient campaign. Outside, the sun continues its slow descent, casting golden light across the battlefield-turned campsite. Somewhere beyond the horizon, new conflict await, new cities to conquer, new victories to record. But for now, all that matters is the steady rhythm of styluses pressing into wet clay, ensuring that history remembers not just the battles themselves, but everything that came after. You step into a modest home tucked between two larger buildings, where the air smells faintly of bread and drying herbs. This isn't a palace or a temple, just an ordinary house in the heart of Uruk. Inside, a family gathers around a low wooden table, passing around bowls of stew and flatbread. But while they eat, one man keeps glancing toward a small clay tablet resting nearby, as if it holds something just as important as their meal. This is life beyond the grand institutions of Mesopotamia. The quiet, everyday world where even common people start keeping track of things. You might expect record-keeping to be reserved for kings, priests, and merchants, but here, in this simple home, writing has found another purpose: personal accounting. The man picks up the tablet and traces his fingers over the symbols pressed into its surface. It's not official law or royal decree. It's a record of debts owed and favors exchanged. He borrowed grain from his neighbor last season, and now he needs to remember when he'll repay it. His cousin promised to help with the harvest next month, and he wants to make sure that promise stays true. Even small transactions, like trading a few jars of oil for a new clay pot, are starting to get written down. Writing, once the domain of temples and palaces, is slowly making its way into daily life. Not everyone can read or write, of course. That still takes years of training. But more people are beginning to see the value in having a record. A contract doesn't just prove what was agreed upon. It also gives peace of mind. You watch as the man reaches for a stylus and adds a new mark to the tablet, a tiny symbol indicating that his brother-in-law has paid back part of a loan. It's a small addition, barely noticeable, but it means something. Without it, there would only be memory, and memory, as anyone knows, is unreliable. Historians still argue whether these early personal records were meant to be legal documents or simply reminders for the household. Some believe families used them to keep track of inheritances, dowries, and land sales. Others think they function more like informal agreements, helping neighbors settle disputes without involving the temple or palace officials. Either way, one thing is clear: writing was no longer just for the elite. Outside, the sun continues its slow descent, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Children chase each other between pots of growing onions and lentils, while a goat bleats softly near the doorway. Life moves at its own pace, steady, deliberate, never rushed. Back inside, the man rolls up his stylus and tucks the tablet safely onto a shelf beside a few others. These aren't epic stories or religious hymns. They're quiet records of daily life. And yet, they tell you just as much about Mesopotamian society as any royal decree or mythic tale. Because history isn't just made in palaces and battlefields. Sometimes, it's written quietly in the corners of homes by people who simply want to remember. You step into the heart of Uruk's busiest district, where scribes are no longer just temple assistants or palace clerks. They're professionals in their own right. The city has grown, trade routes have expanded, and with every new deal, every new law, every new tax, There's more work than ever for those who know how to press symbols into clay. Here, among the grand buildings and shaded courtyards, scribes aren't just record keepers anymore. They're trusted advisors, legal experts, and financial planners all rolled into one. Kings and merchants alike rely on them to make sure everything runs smoothly. Need to draft a contract? Call a scribe. Want to settle a land dispute? Get a scribe involved. Looking to prove that your neighbor still owes you 3 jars of oil from last harvest season? You guessed it, find a scribe. They've even started developing specialties. Some focus on temple records, others on royal accounts, while few take private clients willing to pay extra for fast, accurate service. It's not quite the same as hiring a modern lawyer or accountant, but it's heading in that direction. Writing is no longer just about keeping track of sheep and grain. It's about power, influence, and social standing. You watch as one scribe walks confidently through the marketplace, his stylus pouch slung over his shoulder like a badge of honor. Traders nod at him as he passes, some even stopping to ask quick questions about contracts or payments. He answers without hesitation, his voice calm and assured. This man doesn't spend his days copying symbols in a dusty schoolroom. He negotiates deals, settles disputes, and ensures that business keeps moving forward. Historians still argue whether scribes are considered part of the elite class, or they occupied a unique social tier somewhere between commoners and nobility. Some believe they held real political influence, whispering in the ears of rulers about economic trends and resource management. Others think they remained firmly in the background, expected to remain silent unless called upon. Either way, one thing is certain. Without them, Mesopotamian society wouldn't have functioned nearly as efficiently. Back in the scribal schools, things are changing too. Where one student spent years simply copying lists of symbols, now they're learning more advanced skills: legal writing, financial planning, even diplomacy. A good scribe needs more than just neat handwriting. They need to understand math, law, and human nature. And with demand higher than ever, competition is fierce. Only the most dedicated students make it through the rigorous training, and those who do find themselves in high demand across the city. Outside, the sun climbs higher, casting long shadows across the bustling streets. Somewhere nearby, a group of apprentices huddle around an experienced scribe, listening intently as he explains the finer points of drafting a formal contract. His voice is calm, measured, but there's an unmistakable sense of pride in the way he speaks. He knows how important his work is, not just to people who rely on him, but to history itself. Because while warriors win battles and kings make laws, it's the scribes who ensure that everything gets remembered. Without them, no one would know exactly how rich a city was, what laws have been passed, or which deals have been struck. Their work might not be exciting, but it's essential. And so, under the hot Mesopotamian sun, the world keeps turning. Traders barter, workers build, families grow, and somewhere in this vast city, another tablet is being pressed into wet clay, preserving yet another piece of history for the future. You walk to the heart of Uruk, where the city pulses with life. The streets are wider now, lined with grander buildings, temples that stretch toward the sky, palaces adorned with intricate carvings, and bustling marketplaces filled with traders from distant lands. This isn't just a settlement anymore. It's a thriving metropolis, one of the first great cities in human history. And as it grows, so there's a need for more records, more laws, and more scribes to keep everything running smoothly. The temple courtyards you once wanted feel busier than ever. Where once a handful of scribes managed grain stores and offerings, now dozens work side by side, their styluses tapping against clay in a steady rhythm. Some sit hunched over wooden tables, carefully copying contracts and tax records. Others pace between shelves stacked high with tablets, searching for old documents referenced in new disputes. There's no time to linger. The city demands efficiency. You follow one scribe into the palace archives, where rows of neatly labeled tablets line the walls like the shelves of an ancient library. Here, royal accountants track everything from military supplies to agricultural yields. They calculate how much barley should be distributed to workers maintaining canals, how many sheep should be sent to the temple for ritual sacrifices, and how much copper needs to be imported from distant mines. Without these calculations, the city would grind to a halt. Outside, the air hums with activity. New roads connect Uruk to other growing cities, Lagash, Nippur, Kish, each with its own rulers, temples, and economies. Trade routes stretch farther than ever before, linking Mesopotamia to lands beyond the Tigris and Euphrates. With every transaction, another tablet is pressed into wet clay, ensuring that debts are honored, goods are accounted for, and promises are kept. You watch as a group of merchants gathers near the city gates, unloading crates filled with exotic goods. Lapis lazuli from the east, cedarwood from the north, spices from distant lands. A scribe stands nearby, carefully inspecting each item and marking its details onto a fresh tablet. His stylus moves quickly, recording quantities, prices, and destinations. This isn't just trade. It's commerce on a scale that would have been unthinkable just a few generations ago. Historians still argue whether this expansion was driven primarily by economic necessity or political ambition. Some believe that as cities grew, they needed more resources to sustain their populations, leading to increased trade and taxation. Others think that rulers deliberately expanded their influence to consolidate power, using scribes to manage the vast networks of wealth and control that followed. Either way, one thing is certain. Writing became more important than ever. Back in the scribal schools, students now spend even longer mastering their craft. No longer just copyists, they must learn complex mathematical calculations, legal terminology, and diplomatic correspondence. A good scribe needs to understand not only numbers, but also people, their motivations, their disputes, their ambitions. And with demand higher than ever, competition is fierce. Only the most dedicated make it through the rigorous training, and those who do find themselves in high demand across the region. As the sun begins its slow descent, casting golden light across the city, you feel the weight of history pressing down around you. This is no longer just about keeping track of sheep and grain. It's about managing entire civilizations. It's about ensuring that as cities grow, as empires rise, someone is always there to record what happened, why it mattered, and who made it all possible. And somewhere, deep within the palace archives, another tablet is pressed into wet clay, another piece of history quietly recorded for the future. You stand at the edge of a crumbling city wall, watching as dust swirls through the air like ghosts of the past. Uruk is no longer the thriving metropolis it once was. Fires have scorched its streets. Its temples lie in ruins, and the rhythmic tapping of styluses against clay is all but faded into silence. The world that once depended so heavily on record keepers, the scribes who tracked every grain of barley, every tax payment, every royal decree, is unraveling. Invasion, famine, climate shifts. No one cause can fully explain what happened, only that it came swiftly and without mercy. One generation, Mesopotamia flourishes under careful administration and written law. The next, cities fall to foreign armies, libraries burn, and knowledge slips through the cracks of history like sand through open fingers. You follow a lone scribe through the wreckage of what was once a grand temple archive. His robes are tattered, his hands stained with soot. He carries a small bundle of tablets wrapped tightly in cloth, perhaps the last surviving records of his people's wealth, laws, and stories. But where will he take them? Who remains to read them? Empires rise and fall, and with each collapse, writing itself seems to vanish for a time, only to be rediscovered generations later by those who need it again. In some places, oral tradition takes over, passing down knowledge by memory instead of clay. In others, new rulers bring their own systems, their own languages, their own ways of keeping track of things. And slowly, the old ways fade. Historians still argue whether the decline of Mesopotamian scribes was gradual or sudden, whether they adapted to changing times or were simply replaced by new bureaucratic classes serving different masters. Some believe that after the fall of Sumer, writing continued in modified forms among the Akkadians and Babylonians, evolving rather than disappearing. Others think that for decades, maybe even centuries, literacy declined until a new generation rediscovered the power of symbols pressed into wet clay. You watch as the scribe reaches the outskirts of the city, pausing to look back one last time. Smoke rises from distant buildings. The wind carries the scent of ash and burnt parchment. This isn't just the end of a kingdom. It's the end of an era. But history doesn't disappear entirely. Even as civilizations crumble, something always survives. A single tablet buried beneath fallen walls. A forgotten archive sealed inside a collapsed building. A few scattered words etched into stone that future generations will puzzle over, trying to piece together what once was. And sometimes that's enough. Back in the city, a group of invaders moves through the streets, looting what little remains. They don't care about records or contracts. They care about gold, weapons, anything that can be carried away. But not everything can be taken. Some things are too heavy, too fragile, too easily overlooked. You kneel beside a broken shelf, brushing away layers of dust and debris. There, half buried beneath shattered pottery and cracked bricks, lies a tablet untouched by fire. The symbols pressed into its surface are still clear, still legible. Someone, long ago, took the time to write this down. And now, thousands of years later, someone else might find again. The sun dips lower, casting long shadows across the ruined streets. Somewhere nearby, a goat bleats softly, wandering through the wreckage. Life continues, as it always does, even amid destruction. The scribe turns away from the city one last time, clutching his bundle of tablets to his chest. Whether they survive the journey ahead, whether anyone will ever read them again, is uncertain. But for now, at least, they remain. You walk through quiet ruins of a once thriving city, where the wind whispers through broken walls and scattered bricks. The grand temples have crumbled. The palace archives lie buried beneath layers of dust, and the rhythmic tapping of styluses against clay has long since faded into silence. This is the end, not just of civilization, but of an era defined by record-keeping, by careful accounting, by the slow, deliberate march of human progress. The scribes who once filled these streets with their quiet work are gone. Some fled during the final days of the city's decline, carrying what records they could in hopes of preserving knowledge for future generations. Others stayed behind, watching helplessly as libraries burned and tablets shattered under the weight of invading boots. And still others simply disappeared, forgotten figures in a forgotten world, their names lost to time. But even in their absence, their legacy lingers. You kneel beside a half-buried tablet, brushing away the dirt with careful fingers. The symbols pressed into its surface are still visible, faint but legible. Someone long ago took the time to write this down. They didn't do it for fame or fortune. They did it because they understood something fundamental, that without records, without writing, without careful attention to detail, society cannot function. Historians still argue whether the Mesopotamian scribes truly vanished or if their knowledge was absorbed into later civilizations. Some believe that their traditions lived on, subtly influencing the bureaucratic systems of Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians who came after. Others think that for centuries, literacy declined until a new generation rediscovered the power of written language. Either way, one thing is certain. The foundation they laid never truly disappeared. You glance up at the sky, where the sun begins its slow descent. The air is cool now, carrying the scent of dry reeds and distant rain. Somewhere beyond the horizon, new cities rise, new rulers take power, and new record keepers emerge. People who, like the scribes of old, understand the importance of tracking what belongs to whom, who owes what, and how much food is stored in the granaries. Because history doesn't stop. It may pause, it may shift, it may be forgotten for a time, but eventually, someone always picks up the stylus again. Whether a medieval monk copying manuscripts by candlelight, a Renaissance scholar deciphering ancient texts, or a modern accountant balancing spreadsheets on a glowing screen, the spirit of the scribe lives on. You stand, brushing the dust from your hands. Around you, the ruins remain silent, but the echoes of the past are everywhere. Every receipt, every contract, every tax form you've ever signed carries a piece of their legacy. The world may no longer use clay tablets, but the need for careful record-keeping remains unchanged. And so, under the soft glow of evening light, you take one last look at the crumbling city before turning away. The wind stirs gently around you, carrying with it the voices of those who once walked these streets. Scribes, traders, kings, and commoners alike. Their words may be lost, but their work endures. Because history is not just made in battles and coronations. Sometimes, it is written quietly in the corners of dusty archives by people who simply wanted to remember.